I like Mr. 50 Cent. I think Mr. 50 Cent is amazing.
You couldn't be more white right now.
What? That's his name, 50 cents. Mr. Half Dollar.
Okay.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is Nat Turney, your host, with my brother, John. Say, hey, John. Was that you saying, hey, John, in some like weird digital language? I said, hey, John. You went, bing bong. I'm like, nice. You finally found a new way to respond. I do like that. I guess I probably should mention that the podcast is called This Is Not Church.
We haven't changed the name yet, right?
For the sake of clarity. Yeah, this ain't your mama's church. Any of the variations we've come up with so far. But man, we're glad to have you with us. Thanks for, I was going to say tuning in. Isn't it weird how sometimes like we still hang on to some of this language? Like, Thanks for tuning in. Like anybody like tuned us in. Come on now. All right. Anyway, we have a guest with us that I think you're really going to enjoy. We are super excited to talk to Barton Breen. Let me get you a little bit of his bio. So here we go. Off to the races. Barton is 59 years old. He's originally from Canada. He's a dual citizen in the U.S. and has lived in the U.S. for 40 years. He was a minister, a district worker, and church administrator for about 20 years in an evangelical conservative denomination. He left church in 2005, has worked secularly since then. He left church entirely in 2008 while working through a period of deconstruction/reconstruction. And then he returned to church in 2018 in an Anglican church that focuses on social justice and is embracing and affirming of the gay community. He's an ally for the gay community and also an ally for the indigenous community. His wife is Cherokee and is a social worker to indigenous families. He lives in Ottawa, Canada, where they're having that trucker rally. By the time this airs, hopefully that will have all cleared out. And he and his wife have both been greatly influenced by The Shack by William P. Young. He's a moderator for a while on that publisher's website. He went on to study the theology behind The Shack, and that was a major part of his reconstruction to where he could return to church in any context. But he understands and sympathizes with those who choose otherwise. He has no books to sell, no programs to promote. What you see, or I guess we should say what you hear, is what you get. And without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Barton Breen, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Well, I'm glad we made this work. We had a missed connection, I think, one time before, and such is the vagaries of technology. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So we always try to reconnect when we can. So we're glad that you're back with us. I'll do like I do very, very often when we have guests, just sort of due to the spiritual nature of the conversations. We're always curious where people come from, kind of how they've tracked through this process and where they find them, how they find themselves where they are. So if you don't mind sharing a little bit of your faith background, that'd be awesome.
Sure. I don't mind. I mentioned I was raised in Canada, grew up initially in an Anglican church, was just kind of, the most important things I remember of that were being a server in the church, playing floor hockey in the fellowship hall, and just kind of being involved that way. My family became involved in an evangelical church when I was about 12 years old. The most vivid memory I have of that introduction was seeing the movie by the Billy Graham Association called Thief in the Night. If anyone's familiar with that. Looking back on it, it does as well, but it had the intended result of, I guess, scaring the hell out of me would probably be the best way to describe what the purpose of that movie was. And so anyway, I was involved in an evangelical church in Burlington, Ontario, where I grew up as a youth, and kind of just began to get involved in everything there, began to feel a call toward ministry, even at that young an age. My family then moved to the U.S. when I was 15. We went from Canada to South Florida and transplanted into another evangelical group down there. When I was 17, I went to Oral Roberts University. Was there for 4 or 5 years and did a degree in biblical literature. So, I was moving toward either being a missionary or a pastor at that time. And then when I was 23 years old, I had cancer and had a bit of a set back with that and decided that overseas wasn't probably the thing for me at that time as I was going through the recovery and everything. I went back to school, finished up a business degree, and then ended up going into ministry within that evangelical group. And just started out as an assistant pastor, kind of working in a lay capacity while I was working in another church, a Methodist church in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, as their financial administrator. And then just kind of began to rise through the ranks, I guess you would call it. I became a pastor at a small church in Findlay, Ohio. And then after doing a few years there, a district office picked me up, and I became the business manager and assistant to a district superintendent for several years. Meanwhile, as I was going through all that and doing all that, I began to have the image that I had of what ministry was going to be like and what the church was like a lot different from the inside than it was looking at it from the outside. I began to become a little bit disillusioned, began to question some of the things that had been indoctrinated into me that I'd kind of accepted without question. I tended to be a little bit more of a questioning person, so I started reading outside of my prescribed studies as to people that I should be reading, things I should be doing, and began to just question those things, and it began to grow over time. I transitioned to Washington, D.C., and I was part of a Presbyterian Church of America inside the Washington Beltway for about 5 years as a church administrator. Wasn't working as much in the direct teaching, so that was kind of a good cover, I guess, for where I was coming from at that point, with beginning to question and not being certain of things. So since I wasn't the one preaching or working in the background, it didn't feel as threatening. And then eventually just kind of began to just have trouble being involved in it still and seeing the things that were going on again from the inside, which wouldn't be necessarily big deals, but it was just some of the hypocrisy, some of the double standards, some of the things that were preached, versus the things that were actually done, and the thinking that was prescribed in the leadership type thing. And so it moved to where I eventually just dropped out of church work. I had a larger family, and so I kind of decided that I needed to move into more secular work in order to help out my kids who had a nasty habit of wanting to eat and go to school.
Crazy kids.
Yeah,
so selfish kids.
So, but anyway, so I just began to kind of drop out. The thing that really got my attention the first time I read it was Paul Young's The Shack. I ended up kind of reading that book about 3 times in fairly rapid succession. The first time I read it completely ticked me off. I was writing notes as I was going through of all the different heresies and all the different mistakes and everything, based on my prior training. And then I kind of got to the end of it, and there was something that still wouldn't let me let go of the book. And I was just kind of figured, well, I wanted to learn a little bit more about who Paul Young was. I found out that he had some association with the denomination that I had been a part of when he was brought up by his parents who were missionaries.
Oh, wow.
And overseas, and kind of began to learn some of his story as to where the shack came, began to realize it was more of a parable than it was a theology textbook, although there's some good theology in there as well. And so then I read it through a second time and began to connect with it a little bit more on an emotional level. And there was a part of me that began to hope and say, well, what if God really is that good? What if God really is that caring? What if God isn't coming with the same set of prescribed beliefs and prescribed actions and things that I was raised, to take for granted within my faith tradition? And then I read it a third time, and then it kind of just opened my eyes. I actually began to connect more, and so being kind of a theological trained person in the background, I decided I would start reading some of the background theology to what was undergirding it. And you get some of that, of course, from C. Baxter Kruger.
Right, for sure.
Picked up from that, started to go back, read some of the old church fathers, Athanasius, the Cappadocian fathers, which I'm sure is going to really thrill all of your listeners to want to go back and read those type of things. But it was good.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
And then Karl Barth and other things, and just began to realize there was a whole world outside the very narrow tradition that I found myself in. And I realized that I could build a foundation based on where others had gone before and what was there, and that there was that I wasn't locked into what I kind of felt like was Christianity before that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of...
No, it does. I mean, So, I mean, it sounds to me like, again, deconstruction is the buzzword of the day. Many of us started this before we had a thing to call it. We were just over it. And so I don't know how about for you. For me, there was no single event that precipitated all of this. You know what I mean? Like the walls didn't all come crashing down because of this one thing, which for a lot of people, that's the case. Something really traumatic, something really paradigm shifting happens, and those things that you had leaned on forever that used to work don't work anymore. And you either walk away from the whole thing or you start to dismantle it. Mine was more methodical. Mine was more, it sounds to me like you and I have trod a similar path. I just had these questions that eventually wouldn't be silenced anymore. And I also did begin to read outside of my prescribed reading list, and that pissed a few people off, which, being a bit of a contrarian by nature, I kind of liked that. That's fine. Oh, you don't like that I'm reading this? Well, I'm going to read more of it then. So, yeah. And then I also found, tell me if this was sort of true for you then, within that narrow framework of the evangelical churches that John and I were both raised in, sounds like you were as well. Like there's almost no, I think I'm being generous. There's virtually no sense of church history. Everyone there pretty much feels like Christianity was birthed at the Reformation. And so I had never heard words. I had never heard the names of, Gregory of Nyssa or John Chrysostom, or go through the list of all the old people that we have read now. And when I did begin to read those things, I found that this ancient version of my faith was now super heretical. It's like, you know what I mean? And you get accused of like, oh, that's just whatever. That's just postmodern, blah, blah, blah. Actually, that is 2nd century apostolic historic Christianity. If you got a problem with that, then I think, but was that kind of your experience too? Like when you read a name like Irenaeus or Athanasius, did you go, okay, now who is that? And I got to go find out what that's about.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it was just like you said, everything started at the Reformation, and I found myself, when I look back at my training, there were certain things that were just, you could, if you were even in the theology classes I used to have back when I was younger, occasionally someone would raise a question, and it was a really good question, I thought, but the answer was pretty much, well, but that's not the way we believe. Right. And that settled it, and then was put down, and then let's move on and look at the next thing. It just kind of began, it's like you said, all those little things over time, combined with the practical inner working sometimes of how these things work. And
true enough, yeah.
I'm not so naive as to say, well, now that I've deconstructed and reconstructed, or whatever you want to call it, and I'm back in the Anglican Church. I certainly wouldn't hold the Anglican Church up as a paradigm for how church ought to be done, and that there's never any problems those things going. Yeah, no. I mean, I'm not trying to put a double standard there, but there's a difference, at least for me, in being able to be in an environment where it's okay to raise questions, it's okay to ask, and it's even okay occasionally to express doubt and not be subjected to shunning or shaming or whatever else is there. God forbid you should have a crisis or even just a small question in your faith and working through things, and need some time to work that through, and need some freedom to be able to ask why something is the way it is, or why it shouldn't be another way, type thing.
Well, it strikes me as so self-serving in so many ways that the church, the church's response oftentimes to our questions is so dismissive, right? Except it's the people who care who bother to ask the questions. Your average church pew sitter who just goes to church out of obligation or whatever, so, they're not the ones coming to you with the hard questions. The ones who are coming to you with those hard questions, they care enough to ask. And to be rebuffed and to be even marginalized or criticized for that does, I think, double or triple damage on them. It's not lost on me that most people who deconstruct are people who care deeply about God and the church and care deeply about getting it right. And so that again, that makes it more hurtful, I think. And those of us who've worked in ministry, John and I have, I'm still a pastor. John has been, and will likely never darken the doorstep of another church unless, the audible voice of God comes to speak to him and he can prove it's not a hallucination. But those of us who have worked in ministry and who have peeked behind the curtain, I think we get fast tracked in this, don't you? I mean, because once you start seeing how the sausage gets made, I mean, man, I tell you what, there's some things you either learn how to ignore or you ask the questions. But is that your experience as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I saw that in the local church, and then when I was in a district working with a group that was overseeing about 85 churches, I was privy to the disciplinary things that were taking place, the standards that were applied in one situation versus the standards that were applied in another situation. Realizing how much internal politics and the who type of thing begins to work in those type of settings, which is human nature. It happens in every organization, but
for sure,
the church sets itself up to be above those things, or at least teaches that it should be, and you kind of begin. It was kind of a difficult thing to see and to work through, and especially when you're in that position, when you're a pastor or working in a church organization, you've got several dynamics that are working. First of all, your income is tied to what you're doing. Mm-hmm. You're actually involved in the church, and that provides a foundation for how your family interacts and what's going on. More often than not, your housing is actually tied into what you're doing. Yeah. And the amount of risk that comes with daring to raise a question or daring to speak up and say why, or is this the right thing to do? The risk becomes, you can just be absolutely hammered, it can be a really overwhelming thing for someone who isn't prepared to have all of those areas in their life cut off at once, so to speak, doing it. So there's some of that as well that goes on within the organizational, structure and operations of religious organizations. So it really makes it hard to. The stakes are high.
The stake, and it's a little reminiscent of how cults operate in my mind. You get, and whether they do this consciously or subconsciously or whatever, but get people so heavily invested, get them tangled up and tied up in that organization in as many possible ways so that if they pull one thread, it all comes apart. The one thing that my wife and I never did, and all our years of ministry, we had been offered at a couple different points in our lives, housing through the church, parsonages. And for whatever reason, I don't think we knew why we said no. We just didn't. No, I want to have my own house. And I'm thinking of a couple friends in particular right now who everything that you just said is 100% true of them. If they walk away, they lose everything. And probably the other thing that's culty about the whole thing is they lose probably their family too. Walking away from that thing is not just your finances. It's also your relationship with your sometimes your parents and your siblings. And like it all just goes to hell.
Yeah, no, I experienced some of that as well. My wife, when I was going through this originally, she was not of the same point of view that I had, and eventually just decided that she didn't want to remain. So, and then I ended up. I've been remarried since then. My wife and I now have been married for a little over 5 years, and that's been it was a difficult thing to go through, but looking back on it now, I'm grateful I'm in a place I am with a partner who is more on board and in the same spot and willing. He has a similar journey in her life as well. So it's been kind of good to be connected in that context as well.
I'll say this, and I'm going to open this up to John because I feel like I've dominated the conversation, buddy, but I will say this before I forget. But I have talked to literally now probably hundreds and hundreds of people who have gone through this process of deconstruction in some degree or some form or other. Whether they'd call it that or not is immaterial. But and I've talked to some who have lost a great deal, who have suffered a great deal, for whom it's caused all kinds of mental anguish and existential crises and everything, man. And yet I have not talked to one who would go back.
Right. Yeah.
There's not a one who would say, plug me back into the matrix, man. I just want to wake up tomorrow in the real world or and I don't care that it's fake. It's not a one of them, and mind you, I'm talking to them after, quite a bit of healing has taken place, and there's quite a bit of, there's some of that stuff's been restored. And so it's easier to look back and then go, yeah, okay, I wouldn't go back.
It takes some time.
Yeah,
it definitely takes some time, and put me in that camp. I'm not eager to, wouldn't be eager to go back into that ever again.
No, I think about the places where, my wife and I served a couple, we've been married for 30 years. We've been in church together all that time for the most part. And we've been on staff in churches, and man, I literally sometimes shudder. No, absolutely not. There's not enough money in the world. There might be enough money. John, $2.5 million. I will go back and spend 1 year at that place. There's at least one of them that I'm not sure it would take.
Okay.
But that doesn't take away or diminish how painful that process can be. And for a lot of people, I remember talking to Michelle Collins. She's one of our first people that we interviewed, and she's brilliant and fantastic. Yeah. And so Michelle had likened, I thought I had sort of come up with it, and it's in her book. So silly me, but so I asked her, I still ask dumb questions when I haven't read people's books yet. You know what I mean? But I'm like, would you describe this deconstruction? Could you use the 5 stages of grief with this? And she's like, yeah, that's like chapter 4. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, then you're so smart. But it really was. It was like grieving a death. It was the death of expectations. It was the death, sometimes the literal death of relationships, but certainly the death of, maybe some parts of your identity. All these things that, that just kind of get picked off one by one, almost like the sniper fire of deconstruction. No, that thing you thought was solid. No, that's not it. And I think depending on how you go into that process, whether you're voluntarily going in or where or you've been kind of shoved into it, probably determines how that goes. You know what I mean? Mine was fairly deliberate. I was eager to start the project. So I don't know. For me, it was, I'm not going to say fun, but there were parts of it that were really exciting. Okay, what's this going to be like? Like when I tear this wall down, what's going to be behind it? But I've talked to others for whom that was not the case at all.
Right. Yeah.
I kind of went into it kicking and screaming in some ways, but
right.
I could have backed off at any time and just said, okay, it's not worth it. I'm just going to go ahead and embrace it and not question it and just be safe.
Right.
And wasn't I guess I'm just not wired that way. I just couldn't. You reach a point where you get up in the morning and you look at yourself in the mirror and you go off to do your job and you look at what's your identity as a person. And for males, we seem to identify a lot through our work and what we're doing. And you just see the disconnect, and it's almost like just divorcing a part of yourself that is hard to disconnect from, and then still begin to continue to enjoy and have, I guess, self-respect is probably the main thing that comes from that.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So I don't know that I expressed it well, but it's just, it's a core thing.
I can smell what you're cooking, man. You like that, John? I'm going to come up with some catchphrases.
Yeah, I think the Rock's already got you on that one.
Dang it!
That was super cringy at the Super Bowl, wasn't it? By the way, can we just say that
was definitely.
That whole intro by the Rock was cringy AF. I was like, what are you doing? I'm about to watch like some WWE or I don't know wrestling terminology. But
I think that's what I was trying to be.
I was like, oh no, make it stop, dear God. That was the halftime show was a billion times better than that. And I actually really, really have enjoyed watching all of the middle-aged white people bitch and moan about the halftime show. So, all right. It wasn't for you. Don't worry about it. But anyway, John, I could rabbit trail again if you want.
Oh, yeah. Let's, yeah. Well, I mean,
I like Mr. 50 Cent. I think Mr. 50 Cent is amazing.
You couldn't be more white right now.
What? That's his name, 50 cents. Mr. Half Dollar.
Okay.
You just have to be careful because if you, some people will take their 45 cents and you end up with Nickelback. So.
Oh.
Weren't you the guy that made the comment too about Skillet? That
I think so.
Like Skillet is what happens when Nickelback gets saved.
Yeah.
Someone made a meme out of it because it was killer, man. Did you see that, John? All that bullshit came out about that knucklehead. He's all, he's like, yeah, Skillet's what happened when Nickelback. I said, oh, that's good. So like I said, I made a meme and passed it around. So, brilliant. That was well said. All right, John.
All yours.
Oh, you're sad. Okay, no, wait, one more joke.
We're completely off the rails, and you're asking me to bring it back. Bring it back home, man.
That's your job, John. Your job is the bringer backer of things.
The bringer backer of things. Well, I mean, we keep talking about it, and this isn't any new information about me, but my deconstruction started 30 plus years ago, right? So you use these analogies, like it's like a divorce. It's but for me, I was 18 years old. So the idea of divorcing somebody didn't really click with me. So, I mean, I could really see it as breaking up with a girlfriend, and the hardship of that. And, especially if it was a girlfriend that you had a close connection to the whole family, say you went over and you had picnics at their house and you guys went on family trips together. And so there was this whole connection with you and the girlfriend. And this never really happened to me. So what
the hell kind of girls are you dating, man?
But I can see where it's devastating, right? As, because the church is really good at ghosting when you decide that you no longer fit their mold. And I've always wondered why, and maybe you can talk about this in your own, if it happened to you as well. I always thought it was interesting that this place that talks about love and connecting and helping one another and bringing people into the fold and all that bullshit that we hear over and over and over again are the first ones to stop talking to you, push you out of their life, excommunicate you, ignore you in public, which I've said before, I'm not sure which is worse, being called out horrific names or just being flat out ignored. I honestly think being ignored by some people who at one point considered you a close friend to be in some ways a little bit more hurtful. Did you have anything like that happen to you as you were trying to
Oh yeah.
What's your deconstruction?
I mean, I look at now, well, there's no other way to say it. My experience was for that 20 years that I spent in ministry, I can think of maybe 2 or 3 people that have maintained any kind of contact with me, and albeit superficial, but at least still on Facebook, able to communicate, how are you doing, type of thing. I mean, what I came to find is in the ministry work I did, when I look back on it, my entire identity and my entire value to the organization was the position I had in the role. And
Amen.
Once that was gone, I mean, on the one hand, I don't think there's necessarily any sinister intent on the people, but it's they're still engaged in the frenzied behavior and the activity and the being humans doing and following the next program, fitting into the next goal, building the next extension onto the church or whatever it is that's generating everything with it. But once you get out of that and you're no longer disconnected with it and you no longer have any, I guess, value felt like value to the people outside of what you were able to do. And now that you're not doing it anymore, maybe they'll be civil and nod and say hi to you if they happen to cross paths. But outside of that, you're completely out of mind and gone. And that's especially true in leadership. And the thing is, when you go into leadership in the church, you almost kind of, that's the dynamic of how things tend to work in churches. The leader's put on a pedestal. The leader is expected to be able to come from a position of positional authority. And then when you take those things away, there's feels like there's nothing left. It's not, you're not just deconstructing and reconstructing your beliefs. You're actually having to establish an identity independent of all of that. And for a lot of people, and myself, I mean, that's just, it's just tough, because you begin to realize, well, who am I without this stuff? Who am I? And what difference do I make?
Well, and Nat and I just had this conversation with Carolyn Whitney Brown about her book that she's writing. And I find it interesting. You talk about this idea of a pedestal, and then she ends up talking about this idea of putting people's up on a pedestal, and this connection she makes with these trapeze artists, right? That Henry Nouwen kind of traveled with. And so instead of a pedestal as a place to put somebody up, it's one of two things that I got from this book. One, it's a place to jump from, to move from there to someplace else. And it's also a place where you are not alone. There's someone there that as you come back, there's someone there to catch you. And I find that way more interesting than putting our pastors and leaders up onto these pedestals as some kind of, icon of virtue. And what happens as we do that is they start to believe that about themselves, right? They start to believe that they are more important than the people below them. And because they have to hold on to this identity, they have to lie and assume a false identity because they're messed up just like the rest of us, but they sure as hell can't show us that.
No, you're not wrong. I mean, well, you and I were raised in churches that, and I've worked for pastors like this. I mean, they just weren't to be questioned, certainly not by the likes of me. And so there was, and I think this is true, even of the pastors that I know who are genuinely good people, but if you put a genuinely good person inside of a structure that is inherently corrupt, I don't think you avoid the corruption of that process. I don't think you avoid the corruption of that system. You can't put somebody in a place where he's constantly being fawned over, constantly being told that he's the authority figure, and without it change. I was listening to this. This is really funny that I make this connection, John, but I'm listening to a comedy. Sometimes when I'm in my truck, I put on music, and sometimes I put on the news, and then I have to listen to like something funny. So I put on like Netflix, whatever, right? So I listen to, anyway, doesn't matter why, but I do. Do you have Netflix as a joke on your Sirius radio, John?
No.
Okay. Anyway, doesn't matter because I'm listening to comedian John Mulaney, and he's talking about being a writer on SNL, right? And I'm making a connection here, I promise. And he's like, but literally the title of the little clip, and they play like 4 or 5 minute long clip. The title of his clip is like, "Celebrities are weird AF," and so he's like, I worked at SNL. I was a writer, and the celebrities would come in, and we'd have to run through their skits and talk to them and stuff. And he's like, and everybody always wants to know, were they nice? So he's talking about Mick Jagger. He's like, well, so Mick Jagger is going to be the musical guest. Oh, you met him. Was he nice? No. Celebrities are weird. He's like, they've spent their, he's Mick freaking Jagger. Like, he hasn't lifted a finger of his own to do anything for, he's been on this ride for 35 years of being told he's borderline godlike. That has to change you on some level. Now, of course, John Mulaney's making it funny, but I think he's making a very powerful point. The guys that I know who are in ministry, who have been fairly successful at it, I don't care how well grounded you think you are. There's no way that you're untouched by that constant sort of like people always wanting your attention, people always wanting your opinion, people always telling you that you're great and nervous to dissent with you. That has to screw with your psychology somewhat, wouldn't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's been one of the things since I've been out now. I've been out for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
Some of the more interesting relationships I have are people that I just happen to connect with who are either just going through that or have gone through that recently. And just being able to reach out to them as somebody who has some common experience and just say, hey, listen, I bet right now you're feeling maybe like this.
Yeah.
And then see the eyes get wide and say, yeah, how'd you know?
Oh, yeah.
And that's the thing is, you get into that point and then you feel like the biggest fear you have when you're in the midst of it is what's going to happen if I lose all this? What's going to happen if people find out that I'm really not this guy they see up on the pedestal. And then the worst fear comes to pass, however it happens, whatever it happens. When it does, and then you're sitting there at the bottom, looking back up at where you were and saying, "Okay, who am I? What am I? What is there left in my life to go through it?" And then in the meantime, you're struggling with your family, you're struggling with your career, you're struggling with not having the stability that you thought you had, and it's a far more common experience than what a lot of people think. I think I saw the stats once, like people who go into ministry that start in ministry, maybe 2 or 3, and that might be being generous now in this day and age, actually remain in ministry for the rest of their life and don't come to a point, and the number of that on people who go into ministry for the first time, who actually get into a second position. I mean, there's a huge attrition rate there, but then the people who actually begin to put together a string and manage to stay in for a while, they're dropping like flies as well. And meanwhile, the organizations are beginning to diminish. The financial support is beginning to diminish, and all those things that are going out in the world right now. And there's literally just a legion of clergy refugees, for lack of a better word. And many of them don't have the support network because the support network was in the institution. And then they come outside and it's like, what is there? Who am I? What can I do? How can I connect? And I've had the privilege of connecting with a few guys, and women who have gone through those type of things. And being able to offer a little bit of perspective on occasion. So, that's an encouraging thing as well. You can almost begin to develop a sense of relationship and understanding from people once they come out to the other side and they begin to look around and say, who else is here?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm always, when I meet somebody and, I recognize very well that I travel in a small circle, and the people that I read and that I pay attention to and that I follow on Facebook, I know I'm talking about a tiny little slice of the population. So when I run across somebody in my town in West Texas, and I go, "Oh, hey, I'm having a podcast interview with," and I mentioned, say, Baxter Kruger, and they're like, "Oh, dude, I love that guy." I'm like, "You and I just became best friends. Like, let's talk about it." You know what I'm saying? I feel like I'm in a scene out of Step Brothers. Did we just become best friends? Did you just say Brian Zahn to me? Who's your favorite progressive? 1, 2, 3. Is it? Yeah, and just, but it's so few and far between. I talk to people all the time about these books that I read, and 99 times out of 100, it's like, "Oh, that's interesting," and they might go check it out, but there's not that like, and so to come on the other side of that deconstruction, or to whatever the next phase of your deconstruction is, and meet somebody with whom you can share some experiences, it's got to be. I know for me, it was revelatory. It's like, okay, I'm not the only one doing this. There's light at the end of the tunnel too. But for some people, I'm still convinced. I'm convinced of it enough that I actually went back and rewrote a chapter of my book and really pretty much just talked about the cult-like tactics of the church, because part of my deconstruction has been recognizing themes and stuff like, okay, I'm starting to see. And one of the things that John and I noticed is when we were deep inside the church as kids, I didn't have any friends that weren't inside the church. Oh, yeah. And that carried on into my adulthood. By the time my wife and I looked up and we had a circle of friends that was we had a pretty good sized group of friends. All of them were in the church. And not just the church, in our church. And so when that first church experience for us really did implode, we didn't just lose the church. We lost all of them too. And all of a sudden we were like, oh, well, and again, you find out, I think, tell me if you found this to be true as well. I mean, well, I think you just said this. Never mind. I know you know this is true. But when you don't have that in common, if that's enough to fracture a relationship, then the relationship was only ever based on that common experience anyway, right? And so when we no longer went to the same church anymore, even, and it seems so. I have a hard time explaining this to people outside the church because they look at me like I'm crazy, this doesn't make sense inside the church at all. But it certainly doesn't make any sense outside of it when you try to explain how you lost all your friends because I decided to go to a church on the other side of town, and they all lost their shit. Like we had just knifed them all in the back and we've all just, we betrayed everything. So that to me still speaks to the inherent problem of these human organizations, no matter how big or how small they are, no matter how complex they are or even simple. But all of that human nature just gets amplified, it seems like.
You're kind of hitting on something that I didn't realize until you were talking about this. I feel this weird disconnect with my high school peers.
Oh, me too.
Now, I have stayed in the area where I went to high school. Nat left, I stayed. So, and we were a decent sized high school, and I had a decent sized graduating class. And I see all these connections on Facebook or even at work, how so-and-so is talking with so-and-so and they're getting together to talk about this, or they got together and did this and I know all these people to a certain degree, but the church didn't allow me to be more than acquaintances while we were at school. So I was nice. I was polite. I hung out with them at school. Maybe a few of them I hung out with outside of school, maybe to be rebellious, right? Because they're outside of the church. But now I'm 30 plus years out of high school where I'm watching my friends who still have friendships and connections with all these people that they went to school with. I have zero. None. No long-term friendships with anybody that I went to school with. Not a single one. I have friends. I have acquaintances. I say hi when we say hi in passing, but I have zero. I'm coming to realize this, and this is kind of sucks. I have zero. I have zero long-term friendships with anybody I went to high school with.
Yeah. And you think that's a result of the church saying, "Ooh, no, don't hang out with those guys. You need to keep it." Like you need to hang out. Actually, I remember being told. Don't you remember being told, John? And I feel like we just cut Barton out of this conversation. Sorry, bud.
That's all right, man. I'm enjoying it.
But do you recall youth pastors basically telling us? I could remember at least one or two times being told by youth pastors that our friends should be the friends inside that group. When we go to school, we need to go seek them out and hang out with those guys. Yeah. That this is your group. And you're right. I still did have other friends outside of that, but I'm the same. And part of, I don't know if it's partly because I moved away. I'm friendly with people from high school, but I don't know. Is that the same way? Maybe it's not the same way in Canada. Maybe high school is a blissful experience in Canada.
I went from the time I was in 5th grade on, I was in Christian schools. So,
you have my apologies. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I got better.
It's a very Monty Python thing to say. I got better.
So, but now it's funny because on Facebook, I was the kid in high school, and I was the head of the Bible study. I was the which was a badge of honor in a Christian school that you were doing that, and the school that I went to when I graduated from high school, I was voted the most inspirational Christian.
Wow.
All right.
Now that is an honor you can hang on your wall.
I did. I did. It got me into college.
I was called a moist inspirational Christian.
Yeah.
It's just one little letter changes everything, John. Went from most to moist.
Yeah. I think I might have been, but I wasn't big enough of a drip. But anyway, I have to tell you, this is what, to put this in context, the high school that I went to, that I've graduated from in South Florida, one of my classmates was Larry the Cable Guy.
No shit.
Yes.
That's funny.
So
he went to Christian high school?
He did. He did. His father was the principal. His father was a minister, Baptist minister.
How did we not know this?
All right, if you're good friends, let's get them on the show. No, just kidding.
Yeah, I don't know whether. I don't know if he'd still take my call, but yeah.
That's awesome, man. That's good.
He used to be in the pep band. He used to heckle me when I played basketball. So
wow.
interesting.
Did he yell stuff like "get her"? No, I won't stop that.
No, he didn't have it at that point. So
I lived in Baltimore in the 90s, from like 95 to 2001. Anyway, but remember, there was a big rock station. There was 98 Rock, I think it was 98 Rock. Anyway, and that's back when Larry the Cable Guy was first coming around and like had his stuff syndicated. And so he would get himself on these radio shows, and that's where John and I first heard him. In fact, weren't we buzzing around Baltimore somewhere? I'm talking in my car, and you're like, "Who is this?"
Was that
we were listening to the Cable Guy.
Kirk Morgan Lopez?
Yeah, Kirk Morgan Lopez, and then they had that, and then he would call in.
Right, he was a call-in guy.
Yeah, and just do all the same shtick he's doing now, but it was pretty fresh. It was
he used to do that. He'd go to the local comedy clubs, and then he would reach out to the DJs in the area, and he would offer to do that, actually, to create a character and call in on the show, and then that would lead to additional promotion. And so, he worked his tail off for about 15 or 20 years doing that, and then became an overnight success.
Yeah, exactly. He cracked me up, man. He was, like I said, it's 20 years later, 25 years later, however long it's been now, it's the same old shtick. But at the time, it was really fresh. It was new, and he was calling in and just riffing on improv stuff, and it was pretty darn funny. But that's amazing. Most inspirational Christian at a high school that was principled by Larry the Cable Guy's dad.
Correct.
That should actually go in your bio.
I thought about writing an autobiography. The only name I've got for it right now is Beyond Redemption and Back Again.
Okay, I like it.
So, I don't know.
Beyond Redemption and Back Again. It's a sort of Tolkien-y sort of reference. I like it.
Yeah, something in there. I don't know.
That's cool, man. John and I were not voted anything in high school. I don't recall you being voted. I would have been voted most likely to, get stoned and live in his parents' basement. But joke's on you, my parents don't have a basement. So, so John actually, believe it or not, when we were in high school, John was the way outspoken Christian. John was the guy rocking the striper shirt when he walked down the hall. I was the guy who blended into whatever group I was in. So if they were all getting stoned, I was getting stoned. If they were all, singing Kumbaya, I'd join in a chorus. So, and John was like, F you guys, Striper rocks, and I'll remember all the goofball metalheads pick on you and give you a hard time.
Well, I mean, it was, we could talk about all that too. I mean, so our parents, right, would only let us listen to Christian music, really. I mean, it was, so I had to be rebellious in any way I could. And so I picked a heavy metal band, glam rock band. As my favorite band, so I could wear these heavy metal looking t-shirts. So I would try to fit in with the heavy metal guys, but I'd be wearing striper t-shirts, flannel tied around my waist, combat boots.
I couldn't pull it off. I was all second chapter of Acts and Phil Kagan.
Second chapter of Acts. That was one of the first records my mom tried to convince me was Christian rock.
Oh yeah,
remember that?
Yep.
Devil's out again. Oh man, Matthew Ward, all those guys. But I used to keep a change of clothes at school, and I would get to school and I'd throw on my Slayer shirt or my Iron Maiden or whatever I wanted to wear. But I had people in my school who would freaking tattletale on me. So I stopped doing it because I had too many people who would rat me out to my parents. I'm like, what the hell are you doing? Why would you do this? Man, you wear, fake blood and upside down cross the school one day and everyone's worried about you. I think that's backsliding. I don't know. I thought I saw him drinking blood, but our parents weren't strict on some things, but for some reason music was a really big deal. We were, so we were squirreling away and hiding our cassette tapes and stuff. And then the advent of some decent Christian rock came around. And so we were like, okay, that's not too bad. We got into, a few bands, and didn't stop me from shoplifting some of those cassette tapes when I needed one. So, I was still an asshole. So someday I'll have to go pay Mike back. I'm sorry, dude. I may have shoplifted that Petra cassette from you at one point. But but that's, see, again, I don't mean to keep coming back to this, but that's another one of those tendencies you see within the church is to isolate, make you assimilate, cram you into a box, take away your own, take away whatever sort of independent sense of identity you have and give you a new one. Yeah, it's soul crushing. That was one of the things that resonated with me so much about the Shack, and having talked to Paul Young a few times is that's so much of what he gets at in the heart of that book is getting rid of that facade. Getting away from this performance based faith that says you are only as valuable as what you produce and only as valuable as how you participate and what function you perform. And yeah, it's liberating, but until people are ready to see it, they won't see it, right? So what's it like now so you are back in church, so an Anglican church, my understanding is Episcopal, Anglican, two sides of the same coin, essentially. So sort of Catholic light is what we always call the Episcopal friends of ours.
Yeah, that's pretty close.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I actually go to a church in downtown Ottawa that's about right in the middle of all the protesting that's going on right now. So it can't even get down. But my wife and I, which I haven't mentioned her too much, and she can talk for herself. She doesn't need me to do that. But she's indigenous, and she works in the area here as a social worker working with indigenous families. And after we married, neither one of us was involved in church. In the first year or so of our marriage, we didn't really have any strong desire, but then we kind of began talking about where would we go if we went back, kind of thing. And we didn't have, there wasn't a statement of faith per se, although we knew there were certain churches that were rigid and so forth that we couldn't go back into because we just couldn't support the way they ostracized and attacked other people in society. But we ended up, when we came back up, when I came back up and brought her with me here to Canada, we found a church in downtown Ottawa. And it's, obviously we're married. Neither one of us is gay, but the church is more than just gay affirming. It's gay accepting and gay inclusive. And we said, wow, what would it be like to be part of a church like that? And then we had to work through some things as well because she's indigenous. The Anglican church has got some hard history relating to, a lot of what we've been dealing with up here in Canada, talking about the residential schools and things like that. And so for the two of us, could we become part of being a part of a church like that when the church has publicly repented, is trying to come back to do something about what its history was? And we kind of said, well, you know what? We know what it looks like. Both of us have our own experiences. We know what it looks like from having been on the inside. We can go back in, but it's different now because instead of coming in and looking at the church as something that's going to identify us and be part of it, it's like, well, we're part of this community. There's people here we agree with. There's some people we don't agree with on some things. But it's a community that's open and allows questioning and allows all the things we weren't allowed to do before. So maybe we can try and make this work in that kind of context without getting into the same pitfalls that we experienced in the past. And so far, it's worked out pretty well for us. We're feeling a better sense of what I think the church can positively do, which there are positives that are there as well. It's just you just have to not become overwhelmed and lose your identity in the midst of it.
Yeah. I hear that. I know you said you don't have any books to promote or anything in your work, but it sounds to me like you got a book or two in you.
Maybe.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but it sounds like you have some unique perspectives and some things you could.
I've written, I've done some writing. I've done some blogs. I read history. I'm a family genealogist. I do some writing in that context. So it probably wouldn't take too much, but I guess I just got to get focused and get to work and do it.
We just had we had Meg Calvin on again yesterday, and she'd be one I'd put you in touch with if you're ever interested in having someone come alongside you and help you kind of laser focus on some stuff. That's what I needed, was someone to come and go, hey, this is, because I'd been talking about writing a book for 20 years, and took her 6 months to get me off my ass and do it. So, but anyway, it's and I'm still dragging my feet on giving the final manuscript to the editor, but it sounds like, I appreciate your perspective. It's been really, really good to hear from you. And, I know John has a heart out, so I'm trying to find a nice soft place to land so we can say, hey.
Well, I don't want to ignore I don't want to end on without, I don't want to ignore what you're saying about the Anglican Church in Canada, because I think and I don't pretend to even remotely have information that I would consider perfect. But, just listening to people from Canada and talking about, some of the things that the church has done to at least start down that direction of healing, right? I think there's still a long ways to go. And, here in America, we have even, I think, at least as far, if not farther to go, because I don't know if there's been any kind of public apology to the native indigenous people in America from any of the churches. I mean, as a whole, maybe like specific churches, but I don't know if there's any denomination that stood up and said, yeah, we royally effed you. But I see that, that Canada is taking those steps, and I can applaud the move forward, but I think there's a long way to go. And I think you would be the first to say that there's still a lot of racism towards Indigenous people in Canada as well as America. And we still have a long way to go. But
agreed.
I applaud you being willing to go back into that. I don't know if I would have the fortitude to go back into that, knowing some of the bad connected to it, right? And I appreciate that you're willing to do that and be vocal and stay vocal in calling out the issues that are still there. So I want to applaud you for that, and I really appreciate that you're willing to do that.
Yes, mucho applause.
I appreciate you putting me on that pedestal. It's a big help.
So your fall won't be too painful.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Speaking of pedestal, so we when my wife and I planted this church, we moved into a new building. It's been a year and a half or so, and the stage is literally 4 inches off the ground. And I said, that's too high. I still don't like it. It's still too tall, but it's literally just a little tiny. So it's more of a platform, but certainly, I've gone out of my way to make sure that my congregation knows that I'm not fit for any pedestal, and I don't want any, I don't want it. So I think one of those things that has to be, if we're going to look at church in a new way, and if we're going to reimagine rather than, that's why I don't love reconstruction. I haven't really glommed onto that expression too much, mostly because I think what tends to happen is we even if we rebuild something different, we still hold on to some of the old framework. And so we still tend to build a rigid structure, even if it's a different structure that's just going to have to get torn down again anyway.
Yeah.
And so I see this more as a progressive movement and more of an evolution. So whatever church looks like in the next 20 years, I just hope and pray that one of the things I think that really needs to go is any sense of hierarchy, any sense that, that's one of the things that really hampered my spiritual growth all these years growing up, was that I had been taught, I'd been told, and I believed that the person standing at the front of the church telling me stuff, that they were authoritative and that they somehow knew better than I did. And turns out more often than not, they didn't, and they don't. And if they would just be honest about all that, we could have a conversation rather than this constant, hey, let me tell you how this goes, But we all know that, and so we're preaching to the choir at this point. But we appreciate you being a part of the conversation. I hope things get straightened out up there in Ottawa. We get them truckers back to work and keep bringing me my coffee cups, because my business is suffering from all these. No, the price of paper goods is going up through the roof, John. But thank you so much for giving of your time.
Yeah,
offering up your perspective. It's been really, really enjoyable. I think I can speak for John when I say that it's been a great conversation. And as we always say, as we're signing off with people, I don't think we've come close to running out of stuff to talk about. So hopefully at some point in the future we can reconnect. Maybe it's when you're halfway through your first book. Woohoo! No.
Yeah, who knows? Don't hold your breath, but I'll try to reset on that.
No, I'm not holding my breath, but that would be cool. So anyway, I will. I'll sign off and say peace.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.